Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Tonight we travel to Ballasalla to find out more about one of the most significant religious sites in the island from a historical perspective. Last week we heard about the manuscript The Chronicles of Mann, which is thought to have been written at Rushen Abbey. And that's where we meet Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Allison.
Rushen Abbey is one of, if not the most significant religious sites on the Isle of Man. Nowadays it's a visitor attraction, and on this lovely sunny day today we have lots of young people running around enjoying the space in the gardens. But originally it was a medieval place of religious contemplation. As the name suggests, it was a monastery. It was started in the 1100s. We have documentary evidence to say that the lands were granted for the abbey to be built upon in 1134, so it's quite where we've got a precise date. The buildings probably would have taken about 100 years or so to complete, and then for the next 400 years until the mid-1500s it was, to start with, quite a strict monastic order that spent their lives praying, dedicating their lives to God, but also fueling the abbey by owning lands, renting out land to farmers, sheep farming. So they were actually quite commercially savvy as well.
What does the site encompass? What are we looking at?
At the moment we are looking at a number of low stone walls. We've got a few upstanding buildings, and they're all contained within a boundary wall. The boundary wall's a bit more modern, but the boundary wall contains what we call the Rushen Abbey Gardens as well. Originally that would have been part of the monastic complex. Excavations run by the Centre for Manx Studies have dug trial pits really all over the site, and they've shown evidence of medieval use of the whole of this site within the modern boundary in the medieval period, and possibly before that as well. So the actual physical site itself, the remains of the abbey that we can see to the north end of the site, are relatively small, easy to get around. The area to the south, which is the gardens, more the open space, that's the immediate site of the abbey. But over the island they held lands as well, which they gave out to tenants or used for sheep farming. So a lot of place names that we know today, Abbey lands for example, places like that go back to these medieval times and when the abbey actually owned these lands around the island.
So you say the Centre for Manx Studies did some excavations here. What did that work entail?
When the abbey complex that we see today was in private ownership before it came to Manx National Heritage, then there were plans put forward to change the site, to put some buildings on the site. The area then came into the M&H ownership, and as part of the project to explain, interpret and open the site up to the public, then M&H, along with the Centre for Manx Studies, started this process of archaeological excavation to actually try and find out more precise details about our abbey, about Rushen Abbey itself. A lot of the interpretation actually that's still on site, but a lot of the interpretation about Rushen Abbey in the past had been about abbeys in general and the type of monastery that it was, the Cistercian order. A lot of the information was general relating to that, and what we wanted to do was try and just find out a bit more about this specific site, what it meant to the Isle of Man and how it worked in relation perhaps to other sites around about in the British Isles as well.
And what did they actually find? I mean, it must have been a fascinating process. What was uncovered?
We had about 10 years of excavations, and initially the excavations were concentrated in the religious heart of the site, so the northern area. When I say the northern area of the site, it's the area by the Abbey Hotel. You can see the church tower. That's the main bit of upstanding medieval remains that we can still see. So the excavations started in this area here, and before the excavations were started, the low walls that you can see if you come to the site today weren't visible. They were all under grass. They found some levels of the buildings as the abbey would have been at the dissolution of the monasteries. So the old Henry VIII thing, shutting down all the monasteries in the British Isles, that affected the Isle of Man, same as everywhere else. It's been suggested that perhaps Rushen Abbey might have been the absolute last abbey to be closed down, because there might have been some confusion whether Henry VIII's rules applied to the Isle of Man or not. But we uncovered the foundations of the walls that stood at the very latest period of the abbey, so in the mid-1500s, 1540. That enabled us to interpret the site a bit more fully to the public. So the site opened to the public as a Manx National Heritage Site in 2000, I think, Good Friday 2000. But after that, the excavations continued, and then the focus shifted to the southern end of the site, which is where the gardens are. But that area, we know, had a cemetery with a double ditch boundary around it. We are still looking at all the evidence that came out from these excavations, and in fact we've got a project on at the moment. Dr. Peter Davey, who is the ex-director of the Centre for Manx Studies, who directed the excavations here, is probably as we speak hard at work collating all the information from the excavation here, and hopefully in a couple of years then we'll have the full story of what those excavations have told us. But we've got literally thousands of artefacts ranging from pottery, bits of metalwork, architectural fragments, pieces of lead, pieces of window glass, as I say, quite a lot of human remains as well. And it gives the impression of the site being in use, not just from that period from the mid-1100s to the 1540s, but actually potentially earlier than the 1134s. We think there might have been even an abbey perhaps on site before that. Certainly the cemetery suggests that people were seeing this as an important religious site and so wanting to be buried here in 1100 AD. And also after the abbey stopped being used as a religious house as well, after the 1540s, we get a sense of the site being used perhaps for small-scale local metalworking, and then of course later on as the pleasure gardens and for tea dancing and all the social aspect of the history of the site as well.
Because that's an interesting point. When it was closed down, there might be a perception that it was boarded up and left. I mean, what actually happened to it at that point?
One of the really interesting things that the excavations have shown is that there seems to have been a clear programme of recycling. You see, the Isle of Man, always very modern, because there seems to have been distinct piles of roof slates, distinct piles of pieces of lead and of window glass, and all these things could have been resold and recycled. And I think we have documentary evidence for quite a lot of lead being sold by the Abbey after the dissolution. So all of this material was being recycled. It's often been said as well that a lot of the building stone that went into the construction of Rushen Abbey was taken away and went into the buildings that make up Ballasalla today. That's perhaps not quite as clear-cut as we once thought, and perhaps that's something that Dr. Davies' work will help us clarify as well. But certainly it wasn't a case of it just abandoned and then left. There was a systematic programme of dismantling the abbey, taking away materials that could be used.
So is that the original church tower?
We have the footings of original buildings. Like a lot of the medieval buildings, these places weren't built in one go as we see them. So if you stand and look at the church tower, today you can see, and you really don't need the eye of an archaeologist. If you look, you can sort of see how there's different types of stone, which sort of denotes the different periods that church tower has been altered. Certainly the foundations are medieval, are from the first stages of the abbey. What we don't have is a clear floor plan, a clear layout of the original mid-1100s abbey. What we see today is the abbey as it was in the late 1530s and 1540 when it was closed down. We know that abbeys, as I say, like other buildings, were changed, added to, bits taken away, moved around. So the buildings that we see today may not have been here in this form in the early stages of the abbey, but it was here for 400 years. So it's like any place, things are going to change. And that's one of the challenges, but also one of the really interesting things about trying to interpret these sites is to, firstly, try and work out ourselves what happened when, and if we can see what we can see, if those were original or later, but then trying to explain that to our audience as well.
Must have been quite a project doing all the excavations.
Yeah, any archaeological excavation is and should be quite a major undertaking. The great thing about archaeology, of course, is if and when you find something, it's really exciting and it's really interesting. But that finding the things is one stage of the whole process. There's a massive amount of planning that goes into excavation. There's also, we've got to think about, is it worth excavating something? Sites like Rushen Abbey are legally protected, let alone in, the ownership of Manx National Heritage. So we always have to balance whether it's worth putting the effort into an archaeological excavation, whether it's worth disturbing that site, and balance that against the information that we may or may not get out of it. So the excavation, if you like, is the middle bit. We did the first bit, all the planning. Centre for Manx Studies did the middle bit, and now we're looking at doing the final bit, which is collating all that information. The fact that we found hundreds of pieces of lead on site. What does that mean? It's interesting to a certain extent to say that, there's lots and lots of lead, but what does it mean? And that's the real crux of the matter. And if we can answer questions like that, then we're a bit further ahead of explaining to other people what Rushen Abbey was, what it might have looked like, and why it's important to still come and see it and value it.
I'm standing inside the remains of the church tower. You say it doesn't take an archaeologist's eye to see that there have been changes made to it, but as a curator of archaeology, what do you see when you look at it?
I think the main thing really is there's the different type of stonework. So you can see on the footings here that there's the really big block work, the serious foundations, and we can see this in other buildings as well. Castle Rushen is a fantastic example of that. But here at Rushen Abbey, as you look further up, you can sort of see the type of stonework changes. You can see the different levels in the stonework. We look above one of the doorways, you can see there's this arch as well, and you can see the different stonework inside that arch that's been filled in at a later stage. Building conservation and building interpretation is quite a specialist technique, and we have some very good building historians on the Isle of Man, and there are also people who specialise in abbey architecture, for example, or castle architecture, and we do call on their expertise as well from time to time. Sometimes it's good to get an outside pair of eyes on something as well. We're so used to seeing these things. You say Rushen Abbey medieval monastery, and it's almost blasé because we're so used to it. But it's where we're standing is it's 900 years old. It was built on lands granted by Viking kings. It's a really important and interesting place. So sometimes just getting that extra pair of eyes on things really helps.
You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage on Manx Radio. This week we're exploring the history of Rushen Abbey, the remains of a medieval monastery in the south of the island. Although many people in the island will remember the site for reasons other than its historical significance.
Tea parties, dancing, strawberries and cream. Great fun, I'm sure. There's so much more to this place.
So we've come inside and we're looking at a display which will probably sum up what people associate Rushen Abbey with, certainly in a more contemporary sense.
Yeah, it was a very deliberate decision to start off the interpretation with the most recent. Quite often you'll go to a place and they start off with the earliest period of a site's occupation when it was built. But with Rushen Abbey, it was such a huge part of a lot of local people's lives in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that we really felt we needed to talk about that most recent history first, so that people could come in, they could perhaps recognise some of the posters that they might have seen, they recognised the table with the strawberries and cream, and just familiarise themselves again with the site that they know of. And then we take them on a journey back through time, through the Abbey. So the Abbey that they saw as, a nice outing on a Saturday night to do some dancing, or a Sunday afternoon to bring the kids and have strawberries and cream, to start them off with that, and then say, well, what else is on site? What else did the site mean to other people in the past?
So we've come around another corner. Where are we now? What are we looking at here?
We are about to enter the world of the Cistercians. So we're stepping back from modern Christianity and modern religion into more the medieval world of the Abbey. why it might have been built, a little bit more about the Cistercian order itself, and the initial layout of the Abbey, what we think different buildings would have been on site. We also have the first of our models of what it might have been like when the Abbey was being constructed as well, just to give people an idea of the kind of things that might have been going on here on site in the mid-late 1100s, just to give, again, people the sense of there were two-storey buildings on site, there were lots of workmen with winches. It didn't, it didn't just appear like any other building site. It had to be constructed stone by stone. It wasn't a quick process. All the associated things with constructing a large construction project, no doubt, would have occurred. Getting the stone, the wood being delivered, not being the right quality, who knows, all these sorts of things that went on. But it's just to give people an idea of that, the Abbey being built in progress, really.
How does Rushen Abbey compare? What's the remains here? How do they compare to the remains of other abbeys in Britain?
There's probably fewer upstanding remains here. I think if you look across the water to the likes of Furness and Revo, they've got amazing remains still there. At the time where it would have been in use and its height of use, it probably still wouldn't have been as impressive, as large as some of those abbeys across. But it was a daughter house of the abbey at Furness, so it had the connections to what was going on elsewhere. So although it may not have been as big as other abbeys, it certainly was. It was in the same league trade-wise, in influence-wise, in Isle of Man terms. Then it had a huge influence on what was happening here at a particular time that this was built. And then we get Castle Rushen as well. It was a time when the North Sea Kings were in and around the Irish Sea, and they had a huge significance on what was going on elsewhere. So it's quite a low-lying site now, but originally, significance-wise, it's punched quite a bit more above its weight, I think.
The kingdom of God cannot be acquired by nobility of blood or by earthly riches, but solely by the virtue of obedience.
So this is far more specific now.
Yes, this is getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of Cistercian life, and also a little bit more specific about the Isle of Man and how Rushen Abbey may have worked in the landscape in the island, the areas of the island that would have supplied sheep, food, labour to the Abbey. The thing about the Abbey was that there weren't a large number of monks here, and as time went on, then the monks came more and more to be required to do the monk part of life, so the praying, perhaps manuscript writing, dedicating their life to God, and so they had less time to generate the income that they needed to do all those things to maintain the Abbey. So they had to go out into the community a bit more, get tenant farmers, also get lay brothers as well, who are from the local community who lived as monks but just were not formal monks. So this area is really talking a little bit more about why the Cistercians were doing the things that they needed to do, and where their influences were greatest on the Isle of Man.
We've come inside this building. What can you see here? Why is this particular area significant?
This is really the first part of the remains of a medieval monastery or monastic complex that people can actually step into at Rushen Abbey. This was originally the abbot's lodgings, and it was a sort of fairly grand domestic building that the abbot would have stayed in, but also that would have been used for hospitality for travellers or guests coming to the abbey as well. The remainder of the monks would have had communal living on the other side of the site there. It was just the abbot that had his own lodgings here, and you can see in the walls here that original big heavy block work as well that we sort of saw at the base of the church tower as well, which gives us quite an early date for this particular building. Rushen Abbey, we think, was the site where the Chronicles of the Kings of Mann were written, probably mostly in the 1300s, and abbeys generally were sites of great learning and education, and it's where a lot of records of the time come from. Those records are not always without bias, but monastic records, monastic manuscripts really supply us with a lot of information about this sort of medieval life from the 1100s up to the 1500s, and certainly on the Isle of Man, the Chronicles of Mann and the Isles, certainly no exception to that.
As we've heard, Rushen Abbey is considered one of the most significant religious sites in the island's history, and there's evidence of that throughout the grounds of the former abbey, as Allison explains.
The site, because it's of such high religious significance in medieval times, has always been used for burials, quite often high status burials. The area sort of between what we call the chapter house, which is the little sort of arched building, and the church tower is really the religious heart of the complex. It's where the church was. The church didn't have an aisle, but it sort of had the church tower and remains, which we can see today. And it's in this area that we think that the most important people of the time would have been buried. So perhaps the abbots, bishops. We have medieval manuscripts, the Chronicles of the Kings of Mann and the Isles. That says that at least a couple of the Norse kings, the Viking kings, were buried at Rushen Abbey as well. And they would have been in this sort of central area, the most important people in the most important place. But the site has been used as a community cemetery as well, and to the south end of the site there's an area that's perhaps not quite as obvious, but a lot more burials were discovered there, and they were far more mixed. There were male, female and child burials, which gives a sense of the community cemetery, I guess.
Given the nature of the people who were buried in this part of the site, it must have been a very significant site for the Isle of Man in terms of the religious connotation.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think it's difficult, I think, from a modern perspective, just to get to grips of how important this site would have been. Religion and Christianity and the Isle of Man in medieval times was such an intrinsic part of everybody's life. You know, you couldn't really do anything without having to consider how your actions would affect your relationship with God in the afterworld. You know, it was all based on this feeling of having to live the right life so that in the next stage, in the afterlife, something dreadful is not going to happen to you. So the religious side of life was incredibly important anyway. To take Rushen Abbey as an institution, we've spoken a little bit about how it owned quite a lot of land in the island, so a lot of people would have worked for the abbey. But just as a status symbol as well, when this was starting to be put up in the mid-1100s, there was no other building of this scale on the island at the time. If you think about, you know, sort of take away the modern landscape, take away Ballasalla, that wasn't even, you know, considered. Potentially there's the cathedral on St Patrick's Isle, but we think that was a little bit later, more into the 1200s. Castle Rushen comes perhaps a little bit later as well. Bishop's Court's a little bit later. So all of a sudden, you know, not only this religious feeling that was so central to everybody's life, it now had a physical presence in the form of this abbey that was being constructed, and massive, absolutely massive scale if you think about the types of houses that would have been around. There'd have been nothing like that on the Isle of Man before this. So people seeing this go up, and also presumably, you know, workforces, specialists would have come over to build the abbey. It would have been really absolutely the most literally groundbreaking event that would have happened in the Isle of Man for centuries at the time.
So the gardens themselves, now they're opened up and you've got families making use of them. What would they have been originally?
We think they would have been gardens. There's a school of thought that suggests that actually gardens, as we know them, actually started through monastic orders. They were put in nearby the buildings so that they could produce everything they needed, not only food-wise, but also for medicinal purposes as well. And so you get the classic idea of the monastery garden, you know, it's got all the cures and things like that. And what we've tried to represent here is an idea of that. There was a geophysical survey conducted over the site before excavation started, and that showed up some anomalies of banks and ditches that crossed each other. We haven't excavated that area, so we don't know exactly what they were, but there's a strong possibility that they did form part of the formal monastic gardens. So that's what we've tried to give a sense of today. So they would have held the herbs and flavourings, but also perhaps more day-to-day vegetables as well that the monks would have needed. So not necessarily a place of contemplation or a place of running about in the sunshine, but certainly functional gardens, but they would have been gardens.
So what are we looking at now?
Well, in the middle of our lovely gardens that look great and colourful today, what we are standing looking at is an area that there's not much in, but was the communal cemetery, probably in use before the abbey was built. So whether there was an early Christian keel site, we get keel sites around the Isle of Man, whether there was one here, that's a possibility, which might be under the existing remains, but certainly from the site as a whole, we've got the remains of over 200 individuals that have been excavated so far, not always on purpose. Rushen Abbey is a very sensitive site, one of our most sensitive archaeologically, because a lot of the human remains aren't very deep, so if we want to dig new trenches for perhaps electricity or water or whatever, we've got to be very careful about where we put those, just in case we might end up disturbing some burials. But this area was the main area of the cemetery. There's been burials that have been exposed from time to time, but in the days where Rushen Abbey was more of a pleasure garden, in the days of the Academy nightclub, then there was a dance floor here, and there were a lot of bodies buried underneath, unbeknownst to everybody who was rocking out to Bananarama at the time. But this particular area, as I say, a lot of the burials predate the abbey, and they contain the remains of men, women and children, so it does give the sense of it was more of a cemetery site for the people of the south of the island generally, which again, this is where it kind of can get a bit cyclical, but again suggests that before the abbey was built it was a site of religious significance already, before the lands were granted by Olaf I.
Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Allison Fox. And we'll be travelling west on the next programme to find out more about another site of religious and historical significance, Peel Castle. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be exploring more island heritage at the same time next week.